bum bum bum. I don't know. If only we had some sort of like a fancy intro song or something. Um, well, hello everyone. This is Leaf and Bean, the conversation that we stupidly decided to broadcast live one day, and are still somehow doing it. We haven't been on for a little while. We've both been off doing fun things.
Well, last time we talked, I was engaged, and now we're talking. You're engaged, so
yes, that's right. So obviously, the next time that we're off, someone else has to get engaged. So, but anyway, yes, Gordon got married, and so that was good. So anyway, but a lot of weeks we were debating on whether or not to come on here, but everything was just so boring. I mean, everything in the States was dull. Nothing was happening. And the only real thing that was going on was the Scottish independence, the Scottish referendum, and that was quite interesting. But the things that you'd say, 3 months out, 2.5 months out, 2 months out, it's usually the same thing. Now we're a little less than a fortnight away, right, from the election, and I think it would be good for us to kind of rehash, go through the campaign, look at the way that both sides have been arguing. We've had two televised debates to also digest, and then on the heels of a new poll that came out this morning. It's just one poll, but it is the first time on the YouGov poll that has people voting for yes 51% and people voting no at 49%. Now, taking into account that that does not include the don't knows and the people who won't be voting or wouldn't say. So, on the heels of that, I thought we'd frame this discussion with just going through some of the arguments, some of the central arguments, talking a little bit about the history, if that's okay, and then just looking at what it means going forward about all we know from this date, if there's a yes vote and if there's a no vote. Does that sound good?
That sounds good. That sounds good.
Okay, so sit back. I have my coffee here, so I have time. And if you have a question, we should be having this little Q&A app to the side. You can ask your question, or you can say your thoughts. I have to say that the only times that we've gotten comments on our videos have been when the word Scottish independence or Scottish Scotland was obviously in the title of the video, because then someone had watched it. So that's good.
Yeah.
So I'd like to just start at the beginning. Gordon, can you walk through the history of the modern nationalist movement in Scotland?
Sure.
But when, at what point, maybe during whatever century you're going to talk about, did it start to be an actual movement?
Well, sure. I mean, that's a good question. A lot of the time, I feel like people try to trace back the Yes movement all the way back to Bonnie Prince Charlie and the Jacobite uprising. We're talking about hundreds of years ago, and that's really not a very good place to start. In the 1950 general election, the Scottish Independence Party, called the SNP, got 0.5% of the vote north of the border. Right? That's a margin of error. That's a rounding error. Right? So
that was in 1950.
That was in 1950.
50.
So it's really only sensible to look at how how the movement has evolved over the course of the last 50 years. So I'm gonna ignore all of the ancient history and just look there. And of course, the reason it got only 0.5% in 1950 is because while there was a very strong, and has always been a very strong, independent Scottish identity, independent of the UK, but a very particular Scottish identity. 1950 was just following on from World War II, where all the nations of the United Kingdom had joined together to fight a common cause, which was the Second World War and the Nazis in mainland Europe. And so the idea of splitting up was just not even anywhere on anybody's radar. And even going over the course of the next kind of 30 years or so, there was a lot of stuff in common north and south of the border. If you look at manufacturing, for example, Billy Connolly, who's a famous comedian, But before he was a comedian, he was a labourer in Glasgow. He said that he doesn't support Scottish independence because he feels he has more in common, say, with a manufacturer in Liverpool than he does with some Highland landowner. And that was very much the case during the 60s and 70s, that you've got a lot of kind of solidarity between workers north and south of the border, and so nationalism didn't really come into it. You could say that the real modern thrust of the independence movement really started to increase during the 1980s and 90s with successive conservative governments in London. There were several. In 1979, when Margaret Thatcher was elected, there was a large number of Conservative MPs elected in Scotland. But during the course of the next decade and a half, Scotland moved to the left and increasingly disliked the politics that it had voted for. The Conservative MPs had voted for in Westminster, and so you saw over the course of the next 2 decades leading up to 1997, where there was not a single Conservative MP elected from Scotland. And so you saw an increasing feeling during that decade that Scots were moving away from politics, or from conservative politics, but that the rest of the UK was not moving away from that. And so you've had this growing feeling that Scots vote one way and the rest of the UK votes the other way, and so you've got this kind of disparity. Because Scots increasingly voted another way, but kept on getting a government that didn't seem to represent Scottish views, the Labour Party, which had been so long in opposition during the 1980s and mid-1990s, said, okay, when we get power, we're going to devolve power to Scotland. So kind of like setting up Scotland as a state, in the same way that the United States, an individual state has a significant amount of power over education and health. They said, we're going to do the same thing for Scotland. We're going to set up a parliament there. It's not going to be an independent country. It's not going to have control over immigration or defense, foreign policy, not necessarily power over transport and so forth, but over health and education and other kind of very localized powers. We're going to give those to the Scottish Parliament, and that will be, on the one hand, that will be saying, hey, Scotland now gets to determine its own destiny apart from London, so that even if the UK as a whole votes Conservative, Scotland doesn't get those policies. And on the other hand, there was a feeling that by giving some power to Scotland, that would kill nationalism right there, because you'd be saying, hey, they would no longer be able to look at a bogeyman in London, and they'd be able to say, hang on a minute, the powers are controlled here. In fact, what we've seen since the Scottish Parliament was created is that a degree of independence has proved quite popular, and so generally people have thought the Scottish Parliament has done quite a good job, and so of course people want more power for the Scottish Parliament, and of course the nationalists then say, well, let's take that to a logical next step and say independence.
So
that would be, I think that's a fairly good summary of what's happened. Yeah.
When you say when the new Labour government came in, this is a thing that they promised to devolve the Scottish Parliament. Was that before that time? You were saying that quite a few Scottish, like at the beginning of Maggie Thatcher's term, there were quite a few Conservatives elected in Scotland.
I have to say, the history on this has been somewhat rewritten. People like to think that Scotland never voted Conservative, never voted for Thatcher's policies, and they were just kind of imposed on us by this London-based English Conservative Party that really had nothing to do with Scotland. Scotland moved away from the Conservative Party, but certainly at the start of the 1980s, there was a fairly significant Scottish Conservative contingent at Westminster, which declined steadily until 1997, when there were no Conservative MPs returned.
So when Labour was advocating devolving powers, was that seen as kind of a, not a tactic, but was that seen as a way for that Labour saw in order to pick up the numbers that they needed in order to get into power? Because correct me if I'm wrong, but Labour does have a very large proportion of the Scottish MPs in Westminster, and if Scotland were to be independent, they'd lose a lot of that.
Sure.
But at the time, was that the turning point into the kind of amalgamation of Scottish votes into being a more mostly Labour, a little bit Lib Dem, and recently kind of electorate? Is that, or do you think it was really just, did one cause the other?
Well, by 1997, the majority of Scottish MPs were Labour and had been for a couple of elections, or
Right.
had been for several elections, but the size of the majority had been increasing. And I've heard interviews with English Labour MPs who pretty much feel like the Scottish Labour MPs said we have to get a parliament or some level of autonomy because it's completely unacceptable that Scots can vote one way and yet they get imposed a different government on them. And so they kind of said yes to that. There's also an extent to which it was supposed to oppose the nationalist movement.
Right.
The late John Smith, who was the leader of the Labour Party from 1992, I think, up until around 1995 when he died tragically of a heart attack. But he thought that devolution in Scotland would kill nationalism stone dead. Because he thought, well, if you have a bit of power, then the kind of movement away from England will stop right there. In fact, the opposite has been the case.
So okay, so now since the Scottish Parliament was founded, then independence has been kind of growing in terms of popularity, or the idea of it has been growing in popularity. To what degree is that a credit to the fact of the way in which the SNP is run or runs itself? A lot of people, the SNP is sometimes very divisive. Alex Salmond is very divisive, but at the same time, they are quite popular. Do you think that they're certainly them forming the government most recently, but just their activity slowly ever since 1997 has contributed to the sense of the kind of lingering sense that Scotland could be an effective single political power? It has enough it has enough politicians in order to make that happen. Do you think that's the case?
Well, I'm not sure a country's success is related to how many politicians it has.
Well, yeah, sorry. I mean, this is like a party that is not. It's not Labour. It's definitely not Labour. Definitely not Conservative. Definitely not Lib Dem. It is a homegrown party that has managed to also be quite popular.
Well, so I guess my answer is going to be yes and no. I know that's kind of rubbish, but I think that's the way it is. The reason I say that is because really up until a year or two ago, independence never really got above the mid-30s. Like if you did a opinion poll, you'd have like 35%, maybe 38%, maybe 32%, but somewhere in the 30s in favor of independence, even with 10 years of a Scottish Parliament and even with several years of an SNP government. Labour, by far the most powerful party in the Scottish Parliament for the first 8 years of its existence, with the SNP actually doing surprisingly badly in the first vote in '99. They had this bizarre policy that, hey, where Scottish Parliament didn't have much in the way of tax-raising powers, but it could raise income tax. So they said, hey, we'll raise income tax. And funnily enough, people didn't want their income taxes going up compared to their cousins down in south of the border. So the SNP lost crushingly, which was probably quite a formative moment for them. But anyway, Labour won decisively the first two votes in the Scottish Parliament, and that was actually the worst thing that could have happened for people opposed to Scottish independence, because what meant was that Labour were always seen as very powerful in the Scottish Parliament, and they kind of had this sense that they were always going to win elections in the Scottish Parliament, and that was really toxic for the Labour Party, who became really quite complacent. And if you ask, what were the policies that the Scottish Labour Party adopted during those first 8 years, it's pretty difficult to name anything that was solely their idea that is a kind of catchy initiative. Because of the way the voting system worked, they had to form a coalition with the Liberal Democrats, and the Liberal Democrats insisted on these popular policies like zero tuition for college university students, People think that's one of the great successes of the Scottish Parliament, but it wasn't Labour who came up with that. It was their Liberal Democrat partners. And so part of the problem was that you had this Labour Party who fielded a B team. If you were young and dynamic, if you had exciting ideas, if you were good at public speaking and good at public policy, you were elected in Scotland to the Parliament in Westminster, and the MPs they elected to the Scottish Parliament, the MSPs, were really kind of the B team, whereas the SNP adopted this very clever strategy of being centre-left like Labour, but not being Labour, and they had the advantage that all their top guys wanted to go to the Scottish Parliament, so they were able to have these very well-spoken people going there, whereas the other political parties, in particular Labour, didn't have that. And so you saw about 7 years ago, I think it was, the SNP winning a minority government in the Scottish Parliament, and they governed very effectively. They did very well. They had this very popular policy of freezing the council tax. So there's this local taxation called the council tax, which is the amount you pay is proportional to how much your house is worth, not necessarily proportional to how much you can afford to pay. And so it's become very unpopular, particularly amongst pensioners who may have bought a house in the 1950s. It's now worth a huge amount of money, but they're still just getting the same pension, and their pension doesn't go up all that much, whereas the council tax always used to go up by 5% every year or something. So they had this very popular policy of freezing that so that it wouldn't increase anymore. And so 4 years later, they won a majority in the Scottish Parliament, not just the largest party, but they were actually, they had more MSPs than all the other parties combined. But even with that, the popularity of Scottish independence never really ticked around 35, 38% or so. But having secured a majority, I would argue, primarily based on being a Labour Party that's not the Labour Party, being a kind of centre-left party that's in favour of, that has some popular policies. Having that position, they were then able to insist on having a Scottish independence referendum. And so, yes, over the last 2 years, people have really been considering it, and they've had a fantastic pedestal on which to make their views known. And that's been persuading a lot of people, which, as I'm sure we're going to talk about, has seen polling jumping up into the mid-40s and higher.
So I think that's a really, really good kind of breakdown of the history of the SNP and the history of the kind of nationalist movement in Scotland. Now moving on to as you were saying about the this referendum.
Yeah.
I know that initially, I think a long time ago, last year, the year before, or even back at university, we were talking, and you said something that's always stuck with me is that if you ask somebody if they like the SNP, but take away the independence question, their popularity is huge. Or they'd be by far and away the most popular party out there. I think that was like shortly before they actually won an outright majority, so you were proved right. But at that point, it was very much I love the like a lot of people would say I love what the SNP's policies are, except for independence. What has happened to get us to a point of as you say, they're the outright majority party in the Scottish Parliament, but at that same time, independence was nowhere near half of the electorate. What has changed between that point and now in terms of the political landscape? Is it all because of Westminster and the fact that it's a conservative government, or are there other things going on here?
I think part of it is, as you just said, that there's a conservative government in Westminster, and so you've got people who actually, the exact opposite of what I said several years ago, hate the SNP, can't stand Alex Salmond. They've been lifelong members of the Labour Party, but intend to vote yes, because they want that separation from what they see as an out-of-touch government that's pro-business, and by that anti-worker, that has immigration caps, that has huge differences between what the very rich earn and what the very poor earn, and so you've seen that, yes, a reaction against a very specific conservative-led government in London, but you've also, I think, had just a very high level of engagement in a debate that people never thought would happen, and so they never really paid attention. And you know, if you look at the latest polling, sure, it shows that 51% of people are voting, thinking yes and voting no. But if you actually look, the number of undecideds is like 6% or something. It's actually spectacularly small. And in terms of the number of people who expect to vote, over 80% turnout is widely expected. I can't remember that any time there's been an election in the UK where there was even 60% turnout. So the level of engagement has been very high because people realize what the stakes are. And so I think the fact that people are listening to a debate that they maybe haven't listened to before, they've never considered, hey, why are we a member of the United Kingdom, or what do those Scottish independence people, what are they actually advocating for? So anyway, partly it's a reaction, and partly it's I think there's just like a high level of engagement by having this referendum.
So let's frame the kind of discussion of how the campaigns have done. In the form of taking apart and picking apart these two debates. Did you watch both of them?
I couldn't watch the first one because it was broadcast on Scottish television, STV, and they apparently didn't think anybody would be watching, and their website was terrible. But yeah. I watched the second debate, which was essentially two people not answering questions, and as one person said, they were both not answering questions, but Alex Salmond was not answering them much better than Alex.
Right. I felt like the first. I didn't really think either of them would do very much. Like either of the debates would do very much. But coming from an American context, I love just watching the cringe-worthiness that is usually these debates. And I actually thought that the first one was incredibly well done. STV did it in a really nice way. The moderator was really good. They went to the audience quite a few times, and whenever you go to the audience, you're kind of bracing yourself for some guy, I don't know, to stand up and start waffling about, I don't know, fish numbers in Alaska or something. I don't know, in the States. There's always these random people that manage to get themselves in there. But they were all incredibly, obviously passionate. You had some people that, kind of told off Alex Salmond, and you had some people that told off Alistair Darling. And so, a couple of people saying, you know what, you're both being very rude right now. You should stop being so rude to each other. So it was very good. I felt I didn't really do anything. I think that it was clear. It was clear that the first one, at least for me watching it, Alex Salmond was not. I guess he was trying to act statesmanlike or something, but he was very detached. He didn't seem very in it. He kept talking about aliens and the Edinburgh Zoo and the pandas, and it was just very random stuff. That was talking about it, and he was also going after Alistair Darling, things that he said, and as a voter, I kind of felt like, well, I don't care what Alistair Darling has said or did. I'm not voting for. It's not like an Alistair Darling that I'm voting for. So I just thought he kind of missed the mark on that. The second debate, I thought it was very poorly organized by the BBC. I didn't like it. I didn't like the setup. I thought that the moderator was very poor. He didn't cut them off when they were yelling at each other. He was a bit useless on that side. But you did see a much more fiery Alex Salmond, someone who was an attack dog, the kind of way that we were kind of used to seeing him, and definitely the room was in a much better mood for him.
I see.
But at the same time, you just had points at which they were just yelling at each other, and you were like, well, okay, this isn't very helpful. So that's my 2 cents. What did you think about the second debate?
What? I think you're right, and certainly there was an extent to which neither of them were really answering questions, but Alex Salmond didn't answer his questions much better than Alistair Darling. Everybody seemed to take away from that second debate that Alex Salmond had won the debate, and if by winning the debate, I guess the only objective way is to say, well, did you manage to persuade people who were either on the fence or on the other side? And certainly the polling since that second debate has indicated that, in fact, the momentum is very much on the yes side. Their vote has been going up steadily. According to YouGov, they've gone up from around 40% a month and a half ago or so to 48% a week ago, just after the debate, and 51% now.
Now, you had said something really interesting maybe a few months ago when we were looking at this. At one point, you were talking about how the polling was tightening a little bit sooner than you would have thought. But then all throughout the summer, it seemed to kind of stagnate and not do anything. So it seemed like there was a rehash of this talk of like, okay, well, it'll be close, but it probably won't happen. And then only in the past week and a half or 2 weeks has it really changed again.
Yeah. Well, so the debate really seemed to get going in November. The SNP released this big book about 500 pages long called Scotland's Future. And at the same time as that, the main unionist parties, Conservatives, Labour, the Liberal Democrats, came out in a united front saying that if Scotland becomes independent, it's not going to be able to have a currency union. They're not going to be able to use the pound sterling as its currency. And perhaps because the SNP put 500 pages worth of thought and distilled all their ideas down into a single book, and at the same to make independence seem like a real achievable aim, and at the same time the impression of bullying from London caused the polls to narrow, and so you kind of had a 55-45 vote by around Christmas, and then that stagnated, you're right, after around March or so, up until about a few weeks ago when suddenly it started tightening again. The parallels have been drawn, and I don't want to emphasize them too strongly. The parallels have been drawn with the independence movement in Quebec, which had a referendum in 1995. For the month before that vote, almost every single poll showed that the Yes campaign, those advocating independence, were going to win. Amongst likely voters, the last poll before voting came out at 53%. And then the no vote still won. It was incredibly close, but
it was 51.
But anyway, you have seen though this tightening in the month before the election. I think it's going to be very close by the time you get to polling day in 2 Thursdays time.
So in looking at the currency question, there have been, I think at the very, very beginning, the SNP was saying, like, this is pre-crash, that an independent Scotland would probably go to the euro. Is that right? And then they switched and said, well, no, we're going to keep the pound. And then there was the announcement, as you say, that the currency union wouldn't be kept. And now Alex Salmon keeps saying we can keep the pound if we want to. Now, correct me if I'm wrong, but that's a second type of pound. That is not the same kind of pound. What he's stating is that a currency union is we're involved with the UK in terms of monetary policy and we're part of that central bank and everything. If the UK prohibited us from doing that, we could keep the pound, but it would just be pegged to the pound. Those are two different pounds in my book. Isn't that correct? Or is that a misrepresentation?
I mean, you're sort of correct. What they're basically saying is, you're right. A currency union would be one where we have a seat at the table. We have a person at the Bank of England who sits on the Monetary Policy Committee and makes decisions about whether the interest rate should go up, should go down, if we should print more currency, we should print less currency, and so forth. You're really having a great involvement. Whereas the alternative option seems to be that if they don't get a currency union, we'll just continue using the pound. So everything will still be denominated in pounds. The banknotes will still be accepted, but you don't get that seat at the table. In the same way that there are lots of countries around the world that use the American dollar. For example, Zimbabwe, they suffered a terrible economic catastrophe in the early 2000s, and so in order to stabilize their economy, they moved onto the dollar. There's no way they have any influence over monetary policy. The Fed doesn't have a seat open to the Zimbabwean government saying, hey, what do you think about insurance rates? But they still just use the currency. To say that it's a different pound is I think is not quite the right way to use it. Think about it. I mean, the pound in your pocket, it'll still be the same coin that you're using. It'll still be the same
but it's
note.
a different reality. It's a different reality because in one way, if we didn't have our own central bank or were linked with a central bank, I would think that that means then no giant bank could be based in Scotland. They would have to be based in the UK. Is that not right?
So the reason the main parties in London have put forward for not wanting a currency union is because of exactly that. If one of the Scottish banks were to experience difficulties, in order to maintain their currency in England, London would have to bail out an Edinburgh-based bank. That wouldn't necessarily be in the best. That wouldn't, there'd be no Londoners. There'd be no people in England and Wales employed directly by that bank, or at least not that many, because it was based in Scotland. But in order to safeguard their currency, they'd have to bail them out. But there wouldn't be a reciprocal arrangement, because the idea that a country of 5 million people could bail out HSBC is laughable. So that's why the main London parties have said they oppose a currency union. Now, Alex Salmond and the Yes campaigners say that this is really just a bluff or an example of bullying by London, and that if we actually vote for independence, they will of course allow us to have a currency union with a seat at the table, and that if they don't get that seat at the table, Scotland will default on all of its debt, on its portion of the debt that it gets after independence.
So let's say independence happens, but the currency union is not, like Westminster actually refuses to enter into a currency union. You have all this talk about why it would be bad for Scotland. Why would it be bad, or would it be bad for the rest of the UK?
Not to have a currency union with Scotland?
Not to have a currency union with Scotland, because I would imagine that if you're not going to give the proportion of the Bank of England away, and to me it strikes that, well, if you're not going to the splitting up of the liabilities and then the debts and everything, I see it as potentially an issue for the UK being saddled with debt from Scotland. Is that not right?
Yeah. Well, if an independent Scotland said, hey, we're going to default on our debt, presumably what they mean by that is they're saying we're not going to take on our portion of British debt, and so the rest of the UK will be left with it. But it could be widely interpreted by the international financial community as being just a straightforward debt default, in the model of Argentina. So I think while there's possibly bluffing going on the side of the No campaign and saying, hey, there's no possibility of a currency union, there's certainly bluffing on the side of the Yes campaign about what they're going to do if they can't get it. I find it frankly inconceivable that a new independent nation that has kind of no credit score, if you like, in the world, that its first action as an independent country is going to be to default on its debt. That I think is unthinkable, and so possibly misguided.
What do you think then? This is a question that there were two questions during the debate that one question for either side that they just refused to answer. Yeah. So what do you think would most likely happen if Scotland became independent and they were not permitted to enter into a currency union, even though that would probably damage the rest of the UK, just in terms of the fact that, well, the Bank of England right now, we are in the same currency, so if you are divvying up the assets of each country, you must imagine is going to be some sort of a hit. The rest of the UK, of course, does a lot of business with Scotland. So if there are transaction costs that are entered into or that are developed, it's going to also harm business, in the remaining UK. But what would then be the most likely option in terms of currency that Scotland would go for? Because presumably they would like to keep their central bank, or they would really like to keep financial services in the country.
It's frankly inconceivable that Scotland would set up its own currency. Right. The the amount of the sheer difficulty of doing that, and certainly nobody in the Yes campaign, at least nobody prominent in the Yes campaign, has advocated seriously for having our own currency. It was really a question of should we use the euro or should we use the pound? And firstly, the euro suddenly stopped being quite as attractive about 5 years ago. And then secondly, it doesn't appear that Scotland will be a member of the EU for at least 18 months after independence. So I imagine that Scotland will continue to use the pound even without having any say in monetary policy, which of course is slightly ironic, gaining independence and actually losing some of your power to England as a result of doing that.
But also some would argue that a currency union, you're giving up sovereignty to an external, body in a way. If you're independent, like countries in the EU have given up some amount of sovereignty by being part of the European Central Bank.
Well, yes, that's true. It's just the problem is that if every country has their own currency, then that makes dealing with trade across borders much harder, and especially as the vast majority of trade in Scotland happens with England or Wales or Northern Ireland, means that having an independent currency and all the mess that setting that up would entail makes it, frankly, a ridiculous idea.
Okay, so in terms of the other big elements, I think currency seems to be the overwhelmingly largest one, at least the way that I, in terms of the currency debate is a very fiery one, and it seems like it's a very clear cut. We have no idea. And then in recent weeks, the NHS has become the Yes campaign has brought up the issues of the NHS, trying to use that as kind of a beacon to debate for. And then also you have people worried about pensions. You also have a few people worrying about just the sheer cost of setting up a new set of a new civil service. You had someone very laughably, if I indeed read that right, saying that it would only take £200 million to set up a civil service in Scotland. What do you think are the next biggest issues, aside from currency, that have either yet to be resolved or yet to be answered by the Yes campaign? Keeping in mind that a lot of these questions can't really be answered because you don't know.
Well, the next big issue has to be the broader Scottish economy, not just focusing on currency, but focusing on the Scottish economy. We just said, hey, the banks aren't likely to be bailed out by. RBS is a huge global company, and so for Scotland to try to bail it out would be very challenging. And in any respect, it's currently 80% owned by the UK taxpayer. So there's a high likelihood that Royal Bank of Scotland and other banks that are based in Edinburgh will move south of the border, and they'll take with them a lot of the other kind of financial companies that are also based there. So that's going to be a hit on the economy. I was actually staggered when I heard this statistic. Scotland's largest export, were it to become an independent nation, would be oil. Now, oil is actually fluctuating dramatically right now in terms of its price, and in particular, the amount of oil coming out of the North Sea has been falling. Last year, oil revenue from the North Sea fell by £4.5 billion, right? That's the entire school's budget. So the Yes campaign has really not satisfactorily answered how they're going to be able to take an economy that is very strongly linked to oil, and how they're going to be able to create a kind of consistency that is able to say, hey, we can spend the same today and tomorrow, even if we've just lost the equivalent of half the NHS in 1 year of revenue from the North Sea. So Yes campaign.
So with that, in listening to critiques like that, the Yes campaign seems to reply with, one, it's not being exploited enough, and two, like Norway does it, so it's possible. is that just simplistic? Is it forgetting things? What's the?
I think it's very simplistic. Apart from anything else, the comparison to Norway is not that great because most of the North Sea oil is already gone, and Norway pursued a policy of, hey, let's save up all this money, and the United Kingdom pursued a policy of, hey, let's invest this money in schools and hospitals and so forth. You can debate the merits of that. Alex Salmond seems to be advocating a policy where he says, hey, we'll have the growth based on North Sea oil and be able to invest a lot, and we'll be able to follow a Norway model where we save a lot of money for the future. And it's difficult to see how he can thread that needle. People have also said, hey, we can come up with a better tax regime to increase North oil exploitation. But of course, a better tax regime, that only means one thing, really. That means tax cuts, right? Now, whether you say it in the form of tax assistance or holidays, whatever, it means tax cuts. So if you give somebody a tax cut, that means you get less revenue coming in. So it's going to be difficult for them to balance cutting a tax so that output increases so much so that it offsets the cost and, in fact, much surpasses, and so you get an increase in revenue from a lower tax threshold. So nobody has explained, as far as I can make out, how they're going to thread that needle either.
Now, you see both sides quoting different types of statistics. You have some say that Scotland pays more tax than the rest of the UK, some saying that Scotland pays less tax than the rest of the UK. How can both of these be correct? Because there seems to be every single side seems to have a statistic that can come out against the other one. And so if you're talking to someone who's very pro one side or the other, they will say, well, actually, that's not correct, and then quote you a bunch of different statistics that all sound quite reasonable.
Sure. Well,
just go over the difference between the people that say, first off, that Scotland pays more tax and Scotland pays less tax per capita.
Sure. Well, the difference is very straightforward, and the difference is oil. The British government classes North Sea oil as being a UK-wide export, and so doesn't include that when it says just looks at the Scottish numbers. The Scottish government and the Yes campaigners do include that, and I think it is reasonable for the Yes campaigners to include that because one imagines that Scotland will get the North Sea oil on independence. So it's reasonable for them to include that. I think the issue of taxation, though, is a very interesting one. I feel like one of the reasons that Scottish independence is so popular is because of the popular policies that have been carried out by the Scottish government. For example, no tuition at Scottish universities, whereas in England you have to pay around over £9,000 every year. Free home care for the elderly, and several other policies. And actually, this was a conversation I had with your dad several years ago, and he said, well, how's that being paid for? Is there a special tax? And I was flummoxed. I had no idea. Where was this coming from? Was there a cut somewhere else? Do we actually have a smaller, education budget in order to pay for free home care for the elderly? I had no idea. And in fact, it turns out that the money gets allocated by London, and London allocates slightly more per head of population to Scotland than it does to England or to Wales. Now, there's a good reason for doing that, and the reason for doing that is because Scotland has higher rates of poverty than the rest of, than say England does, because England's got a very rich area in London. So there's a good reason for doing that. But anyway, it means that the Scottish Parliament, not having much in the way of tax-raising powers, has been able to spend on popular things, but then hasn't had to do the unpopular half of that equation, which is the raising taxes or making other cuts.
Right. Interesting. Okay. So, how do you think the news over the past few days is going to be shaping the remainder of the campaign? In that, when the Westminster parties kind of were supposed to make their declaration of all the things that Scotland was going to get if they voted no, it didn't really happen. They said, most likely you're going to get more powers, but we're not really going to say what that was. Today we've read that, they're going to be scrambling together to actually come up with some concrete things. Cameron's having emergency meetings with the Queen in Scotland, of course, and Cameron's facing calls that if there was an independence vote for it, he should resign. Some people are even saying, well, if he ever said that he'd resign if there was a yes vote, that would guarantee a yes vote. So the past week has been, he also has a NATO summit in his backyard, him being the leader of a country that might not be a country anymore. It's been quite a dramatic week for David Cameron. And how has that changed, and how do you think it's going to be framing this final fortnight?
Well, framing the final fortnight from the point of view of the No campaign, one word: panic.
Yeah.
And I think you actually saw that in George Osborne's interview today, where he announced further powers and a kind of great grand settlement. We've already had discussions about more powers and so forth. Suddenly pulling this rabbit out of the hat a day after, or the same day as this poll was printed, really does sound like panic on behalf of no campaigners, and I think part of it is a complacency. This was the first time the Yes campaign have ever gone above 50%, and I think probably a majority of people thought, well, there's a lot of anger about London's policies or UK policies, how they've affected Scotland, but that we'll have this referendum, the No campaign will win, and then we'll really start the work of winning hearts and minds, so to speak, to the idea of a United Kingdom. And yes, that will mean more powers to the Scottish Parliament and so forth. I think they realised that they need to really accelerate their efforts over the next 10 days or so, especially as people have already started voting. I include myself in that. I received my postal ballot a week ago and voted on Tuesday. So time is running out. One thing I would say, though, is the Quebec election. On the eve of the poll, it was 53% in favor, and the actual result was 51% against, or 50.5%.
I mean,
it was very close.
These polls, I mean, to a certain extent, they really are. It's not like they happen every year, so it's very hard to be able. And the fact that also this vote's allowing in 16-year-olds, it's allowing in foreigners. There's a lot of different. The electorate is quite different, as you say, potentially an 80% turnout. It's just a very different type of electorate than it would be under normal conditions.
Well, and it's a very different type of election. Normally, a vote that happens, if you make a mistake, if the voters feel like they made a mistake, they can undo it in 4 years' time by voting for the other guys. That's not an option this time round. So that's part of the reason you're seeing such high levels of engagement.
Yeah. So what are you expecting for this final fortnight?
I expect the Yes campaign to continue talking about momentum and to start up talking even more than they have already been doing so, talking about, hey, you know what? If we vote yes in 2 weeks' time, then we're going to have an Independence Day, and everything they can do to make it feel more tangible, more reachable, just there. I think we'll be talking about that. The Yes campaign will be talking about that. The No campaign, it's a bit late for them to start pulling out new policies or a new strategy. I think what you're just going to see is them trying to say, hey, independence, there's a real prospect it could happen, so you really, really need to consider if that's something you want. Don't vote yes as like to make a statement against David Cameron or his policies. You have to vote for what you want to wake up. You have to vote for the outcome you want to wake up to the day after the vote.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Do you think that there are any more rabbits coming?
Any more rabbits being pulled out of the hat? You mean like in the presidential elections in the U.S. There's always an October surprise or something?
Yeah, exactly.
About a week or two before the polling. Well, if I knew what the surprise was, it wouldn't be a surprise. I find it difficult to imagine there could be any more rabbits pulled out of the hats. Most of the policies have already been focused on, and the policy to do with the economy have already had some focus, and I don't see that any policy shift focus is really going to have much of an effect. I think there was some hay to be made out of focusing on foreign policy. For example, this book, Scotland's Future, which was the Yes campaign's 500 pages on what they think an independent Scotland should be like. They say in this that the UN Security Council should get a veto over Scottish foreign policy. That may have been popular just after the Iraq War, but the idea of giving President Putin a veto over Scottish foreign policy now is pretty toxic. But frankly, I've made that point. Nobody else has made that point because it's a bit late in the day now to be making that kind of a point. So I don't see there going to be many more policies like that. I don't see that there's, President Obama has already come out and said everybody who's got an opinion on this has already said what their opinion is, and so I don't see any rabbits being pulled out of the bag, so to speak.
What do you think is going to happen then?
I think that the Yes campaign are going to stagnate on 51% over the next few polls, and on election day itself, it's going to be following the kind of Quebec model of them actually getting 49% in the end. But I understand that a majority, that Nate Silver, who's kind of the lead statistician who's taken a look at this, reckons the no vote definitely will win, and I understand that most foreign diplomats in consulates in Edinburgh think the Yes campaign will definitely win. So, it doesn't matter how hard you look at it, you don't get a better sense of these things. So my hunch is the no vote will prevail, but we'll have to see. What's your opinion?
I don't know. I have to say I think a lot of people are enamored with the idea of an independent Scotland. They love the optimism associated with that. And I also think it's been very difficult, and I think the No campaign has done a very poor job, but a difficult job as well. They've done a poor job of having a positive message for staying. And part of that is, well, they don't have concrete policies that they can run on, whereas the Yes campaign can say, we won't be part of the UK, we can make our own future, we can decide X, Y, Z, we can kick out nuclear weapons, blah, 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 blah. The No campaign can't really do that because they're arguing for things to say exactly the same, and so it's naturally quite difficult to talk to someone and for you to say isn't the union great, and for them to say, well, no, it's not helping me, and then try and convince them to stay, because you could easily say, well, why haven't you made the changes already? Well, why aren't I feeling this positive thing already? So I can see that the No campaign had its work cut out for it anyway. But it was the burden. It was the burden of the Yes campaign to prove them wrong and to prove the status quo is not better than uncertainty. And so I definitely see that there's a lot of optimism, and even in people who are planning to vote no, there's a lot of optimism in potentially there being an independent Scotland. I mean, I actually thought that J.K. Rowling's article, her statement, was actually, I think she cut to what a lot of people on the no side probably think. And I think at the very end of her statement, it said something along the lines of, whatever happens, I'll want to work with Scotland. I want to live there. It's my home. If it's an independent Scotland, I'll be there. I want to see it succeed. It's just that I think it will succeed better if it's if it has more powers and part of a wider government. So I do get the sense that you do have the kind of ardent unionists, and usually then you talk about the ardent nationalists that want a republic. They want to do away with the Queen. They want it completely different, and they're usually quite angry people, frankly. But then you have the optimists, like the kind of more liberal, a lot more like students, but kind of the kind of progressive left-wing people who also don't like Westminster. They don't like the Tories. And those people they have very good arguments. They articulate themselves well, and they don't come with the kind of ardent anger that the hardcore nationalists come with. But you also have this group of people that's kind of, and this is why I think the undecideds have been so high. There have been, up until this last week, 12% undecided and more. You have this group of people that are timid. They're worried. I was talking to a friend the other day that they said they don't really they feel like they're going to be turning their back on Scotland voting no, but they don't want to vote yes, and it's almost like they believe that no is the right option, but if it was a yes, then they're all gung ho about it, and I do think that group of people, there are actually a lot more of those people than I think people realize. And I think that's one key area of, if their optimism can outweigh their concern, they could easily become yes voters, and so I don't know how the yes campaign is it needs to. I think what they need to do is they need to tone down. It's not like they're flagrant burning people at the stakes anyway right now. I think the yes campaign has actually been pretty well run, but they need to try and keep those hardcore nationalists in line, and they need to hype up the optimism, and as you say, hype up the inevitability. And but I don't know if they could do it in time. And I agree with you. I think it's still, at this point, I think it's still a no, because I think the yes campaign needs to be at like 58% before you can be sure that it's going to be a yes, because I wouldn't trust. Also, what people say and what they vote might be different, and I think you're much more likely to change your vote out of worry than change your vote out of excitedness. So I think it will still be a no, but I think it will be close, and I think that what the Westminster government decides to do as a response to it is gonna really matter to whether or not we have this again. And if we have it again, because the Westminster government hasn't done anything, then I think it would be an overwhelming yes. Like, people won't even they won't bat an eyelid. So
I mean,
it's a bit of a waffle. But
I'm definitely trying to think that you're right. If it is a no vote, they need to continue. I mean, not necessarily campaigning, going door to door, but they need to continue trying to win hearts and minds for the union. Because you're right. If we have the vote in 10 years' time, it would be ridiculous. They need to win, and win for a generation.
Yeah, exactly. And I do like the idea. I think we were talking to somebody that they were, I was seeing some analysis of the first debate, and they said, isn't it interesting that you take Alex Salmond and Alistair Darling, and if you take away independence, they're basically the same. They're basically the same. And it just tells you of what a unique place Scotland is. You're having two people arguing their heads off about independence, and they're basically the same. They're same politics. It's actually a very, very progressive country, and I think that was a very, very just in terms of like the political culture and things like that. So I think that is quite telling to show that this is I don't know about you. I guess from over there you've probably only been reading about it, but I get the sense that I think that the tone of this campaign, on balance, look, this is potentially making a new country. The tone of the campaign has actually been, on balance, I think pretty good. I think it's been quite interesting. I've certainly been fascinated by the arguments both sides. I know that you hear about people flaring up on both sides and threatening people and throwing eggs and doing what have you, but the amount of partisanship that happens in the lead up to a U.S. general election is laughable. And also this isn't Ireland, and I think a lot of people. I mean, I know that probably doesn't enter into anybody's minds, but maybe from a sort of outsider's look, you could think that it could have been. Couldn't it have been like Ireland? And when you're on the ground here, no, it's completely different. But it's been a very interesting process that I don't think has been followed. For all the talk here of it's been the only thing on TV, it has been compared to a U.S. election. If this was happening in the U.S. and Texas was wanting to go, this would be headline news, morning, noon, and night, wherever you were.
Sure.
I get the sense that in London and in the rest of the UK, up until the past couple of weeks, it's been like, one of the 5 things, but it's been like number 4 or number 5 in the stream. I just don't think they're switched on to it. I think like Radio 4 kept saying that like the complaints that they get was like, stop talking about the Scottish election already, because we don't care and we just want to move on. And they weren't really talking about it very much. So that's also been very interesting. I don't think England, Wales, Northern Ireland they don't seem to be as engaged as I was expecting them to be.
Well, and I think though that might change after today when. With polling showing a statistical tie, and actually the Yes campaign may be slightly ahead, that people might actually take the campaign seriously. I think possibly people who weren't really paying attention, just on the impression that it would be a 60-40 vote against independence, and then we'd all just get on with our lives. And since that seems like it's really not going to be the case, and it is going to come down to the wire, you might get a high level of engagement. Plus, as you get closer to the thing, it becomes more important anyway. But I absolutely agree.
Well, okay, it's going to be a very interesting time. Maybe we'll chat about it next week and preview the last, because I imagine that this week is going to be quite interesting as well. But
yeah.
So with that, would you like to move on to a bit of a quiz?
Yes, let's move on to a bit of a quiz. It's the first time in a long time we've been able to do our famous or perhaps infamous LeafnBean quiz. Do you want to go first, or shall I go first?
I don't mind. I have entirely Scottish trivia.
Okay.
So, I'll go first. Okay.
Okay, that sounds good.
All right. So, the oldest building in Britain is in Scotland. What is the oldest building? I don't know. St. Margaret's Chapel in Edinburgh Castle? No, come on. Much older than that.
Okay, what's the oldest building?
Skara Brae on Orkney.
Oh, well, I mean, sure, it doesn't have like a roof or anything, right? I mean, if we're going to say...
Yeah, it does. It does. It dates from 3100 BC.
My goodness.
Yeah.
Okay.
Right.
Well, okay. So my questions are not on Scottish trivia.
Okay.
So the new Prime Minister of Thailand, who you may remember came to power in a coup d'état, that's General Prayuth Chan-o-cha. He's currently suffering from a sore throat and a pain in his neck. What does he blame for those two ailments? Sore
throat and a pain in his neck.
Yeah. Yes.
And it's not like a person being a pain in my neck.
No.
He's straining because he's watching too much TV. I don't know.
No. He's blaming black magic. He's saying that some of the locals in Thailand have been casting spells on him. He's been purifying himself by chucking holy water over him, but he's still suffering from some side effects of the sore throat.
Well, I wasn't going to get that anyway. Okay. When was Scotland... Scotland was an independent country until what date? An independent country until what date?
Well, the Act of Union was in 1707.
But?
Well, so it was still a self-governing country up until 1707. It had its own parliament and its own foreign policy. You're clearly asking me at what point did King James VI become King James I of England, and I can tell you it's around 1604, I think.
Oh, I'm going to give that to you. It's 1603.
1603, but it was still an independent nation until 1707.
Right. Okay. Fine. But it had the same. Actually, technically, it would go back to that status anyway.
It would go back to that status, yes, because the Queen would still be the head of state in the event of a yes vote.
Okay.
So there's a boy called Dmitry Danenko, and he's from Belarus, and he was arrested after participating in the ice bucket challenge. Why was he arrested?
Why was he arrested? In Belarus.
In Belarus.
Was it because he did the ice bucket challenge on a statue of the Belarus's weird dictator guy?
Well, so you're nearly right. You're right. Belarus is the last kind of European dictatorship, and after being doused in water you get to nominate who should go next, and he nominated dictator President Alexander Lukashenko and was fined and told to take the video down.
Oh, wow. See, you know what? If you're a dictator, easy way to counter that, just do the damn thing.
Just do the damn thing, right? Yeah.
I know. Although I have to say that was pretty sappy that Obama didn't do it.
Well, Alex Salmond did it, but David Cameron did not.
No, but Alistair Darling did it first. As soon as it started to be a thing, Alistair Darling quickly did it so that he could say it was. It was so funny, so petty. But anyway, okay.
Okay, so 1-1 right now.
1-1. I have a few of these, so I'm just trying to.
Okay.
Okay. What was the there? A place in Scotland had the very first city. It was the very first city or town in the world with its own fire brigade. So London is laid claim to the first professional police force. This town / city had its first had the world's first fire brigade. Which one was it?
It was Edinburgh.
It was. Good job.
Yes, it was. Yes, a claim to fame of sorts there. I don't think London got its first professional fire brigade until after the Great Fire of London, which is kind of a bit late in the day for all that.
That was definitely a reactionary tactic.
A reactionary tactic. So there's a bank in Russia called the Sberbank, which is in an attempt to try and get more people to take out mortgages with them, have said, with every mortgage you take out, we will also give you a what?
It's called Sperm Bank?
It's called Sberbank. S-B-E-R. Sberbank.
Okay. Sorry. So if you take out a mortgage, we will give you blank.
Yeah.
And this is just for like, is it a thing? Is it a?
It's a thing. It's a thing.
A little little Russian doll.
A little Russian doll? Well, actually, no. In fact, what they will do is they will loan you a cat. Apparently, there's a tradition that says it's good luck if the first person across the threshold of a new house is a cat. So they say, if you take out a mortgage with us, we will lend you for 2 hours our cat. And they have a whole range of cats on offer. You can go on their website. They have every different type of cat you can choose from. To be the first across your threshold. So,
wow.
For a bank, get the loan of a cat as well.
Well, meower days, they'll do anything to succeed, I guess.
Wow.
Yep. Okay. Let's see. All right. In 1712, the town of Sanquhar established this, and they claim it to be the oldest thing of these in the world. So it's a service. It's another kind of service, yeah.
What? So in the same way that Edinburgh established a fire brigade, they established something else?
They established something else. It is a singular entity. It's a singular thing, but yeah, that they say that they established it. It's something that everybody uses nowadays. Not so much anymore for everybody, but it's still certainly very, very much used.
So used, but not by everybody today. Like maybe free schools.
No, it's not used to the degree to which it was used before, but it's still certainly used, especially. Yeah, with certain kinds of things, but as of the maybe noughties, its use has diminished, has gone down.
And this is 1713.
So in
my goodness, I have no idea. I have no idea. You have to tell me the answer.
The post office.
Oh really? Oh gosh.
Apparently, the post office is at Sanquhar, established in 1712, claims to be the oldest working post office in the world. The town also has the world's oldest curling society, formed in 1774.
Goodness. The Bulgarian government has received a representation from the Russian embassy exhorting them to take measures to prevent what happening to Soviet-era monuments that still reside in the country?
Preventing them to be pillaged?
Nearly. Apparently there's a movement to spray paint them so that Stalin ends up looking like Captain America, or Lenin ends up looking like Superman.
Oh, that's great.
That's pretty great.
That's great. Oh well. I guess they probably weren't going to be all for that, I guess. Cool. Well, was that 5?
No, I still have one more question.
Okay. All right. So it's
but we're currently, I think it's 1-1 right now.
Yes, it is. All right. This should be a pretty easy one for you.
Okay.
The oldest surviving bank in the UK was founded in 1695 in Scotland. It was also the first bank in Europe to print its own banknotes, something that it still does today. What bank was that?
The oldest bank?
The oldest surviving bank.
There are only 3 banks in Scotland that print their own money, so that narrows it down. So it's either
one
Clydesdale.
of them is an Australian bank.
Is Clydesdale Australian?
Yeah.
Oh. Okay, well, so then we're narrowed down to either the Bank of Scotland, which is now the Halifax Bank of Scotland, which was then Lloyd's TSB Halifax Bank of Scotland. So I'm going to have to say that it's the Royal Bank of Scotland.
You would be incorrect.
Oh, really?
Apparently it's the Bank of Scotland.
Oh, it is? Oh, gosh.
Yeah. So there you go.
Well, so there I go. So my last question is about Oktoberfest celebrations. So they're currently under threat from a strike of what?
A strike. Oh, well, okay. It must have to do with either beer or, like, I don't know, like beer maidens. So I'm gonna say or maybe a strike of bartenders. Let's go with that.
Nearly. It was actually a strike on bakers who make pretzels, and apparently you can't go to Oktoberfest without buying a pretzel.
Ooh, that's not good. They really have themselves in a twist, I guess.
Ha. Okay. Well, you can get more of this buffoonery next week if this has floated your boat, yeah. And if not, then you should not tune into our channel. We're probably talking more about Scottish independence next Sunday. It'll be 5 days before the vote, and we'll have even more, I'm sure, panicked politicians talking about worrying Parliament, or alternatively, we're going to have even more smug politicians talking about successful Parliaments. So that's what's to look forward to next week.
Alrighty. Have a good week, Gordon.
Oh, and you too.